right, for that justice, Guru Tegh Bahadur, the 9th Guru, himself walked to Delhi and gave himself up for arrest, and he challenged the emperor. That if you can make me forcibly give up my faith, if you can torture me, instill fear in me, do whatever you can do, then these others will follow. But if I resist, then you must accept that truth and justice prevail in this country. And for that he gave his head. From then on, the Sikhs went through a turbulent history. We were hunted. We were hunted until there were no more than 200-300 left of us in the whole world. In the jungles, in the deserts, in the mountains. We came back, we created our own kingdom of Panjab. We eventually lost it to the British. The British themselves have a special relationship with the Sikhs, let's say. Again, we'll explore that in more detail later. But we lost our kingdom to the British, but during that time, we experienced the global freedom. But having been persecuted, having been cut into pieces, hunted down, not only were we killed wherever possible, not only were we tortured as a community, as a people, our language, our words, our scriptures were burned. So any text of the Sikhs, Gurus, their history, their writings, were set to fire. Words like Gobind, which means God, and also the name of the 10th Guru, were banned, outlawed. Anyone heard uttering these words was put to death. The word Granth, which is again the name of scripture of our current Guru, was again outlawed and banned. Anyone saying these words would be put to death. So not only was it exterminating a people, it was exterminating their identity, exterminating their history, exterminating their language, to such an extent that people wouldn't even accept that they ever existed, because to talk of their existence meant being put to death. And again, this is history, that these are people. And what do we always say about history? We need to learn from our history. How many times has this pattern been repeated across the globe in different communities, in different dates? Did you not see this in Germany, burning of the books? Are there not words today in the English language which are pretty much barred? If you utter them in the wrong place, in the wrong crowd, you're not put to death, but are you not under suspicion? Are you free to discuss as you would like to discuss in every arena in the world? So these are the human issues that we've had to endure. But as I said, we lost our kingdom to the British. The special relationship turned sour. And the Sikhs decided that slavery wasn't for us. It wasn't something that we were going to accept. Because the teachings of our Gurus taught us that it wasn't just, again, if I deviate very quickly, the British rule in India was not just rule. The East Indian Company, as many of you will have heard, was determined to sell opium to China. You guys, if you haven't heard of this, read into it. It's a very interesting story. They were convinced that opium to China was the best way to make as much money as possible. So they stopped growing crops in certain parts, particularly around Bengal in India. So crops which fed the people, which fed their families, was uprooted, and opium was forced to be planted. Opium was then sold to the Chinese. When the Chinese government found its people addicted to the drug, they said, we refuse to take on any more sales of this, and they actually dumped, I think, about 25,000 crates of opium into the sea. What did the East Indian Company do with the support of the British Navy? They went down the key Chinese river, whose name I forget, they bombarded Chinese cities, they forced China to continue to buy opium, and they took Hong Kong. So this is the state of British rule and the rule of the East Indian Company for making profits in India. So this is what the Sikhs were crossing against, this is what we fought against. And as part of that fight, yes, there were peaceful protests. Yes, there were peaceful moments. Yes, there was political debate. But there was physical taking of arms as well. And one of the key individuals who took part in this freedom movement was a young man of 16 years old called Kartar Singh Saraba. And Kartar Singh left India at the age of 16 because he couldn't live in that country any longer. Those people were being oppressed. And he moved to Berkeley University in California. So this part of the world. And there he thought, I'm going to create myself a new life, I will get an education, I will build my life, I will build my future here. Yet in the University of Berkeley in California, when he went around, he saw signs which said no dogs and Indians. This was 1913. And he said, he realized that a slave is a slave no matter where he lives. If we are slaves in India, the whole world recognizes us as slaves. And what he did was he created a movement at the age of 16, and he called it the Ghadar Party. Ghadar means rebel. And what he organized, along with his associates, were various Indian nationals who lived around the globe, and they organized themselves into a unit. They created newspapers, they created posters, and they obtained arms, and they actually jumped on ships and went back into India to fight a civil movement there. Kartar Singh Srabha was hung at the age of 18, and these are some of his compatriots, struggling for freedom, because slavery was not their due. Slavery was not the life they wanted to live. Over time, India was freed. And in 1947, perhaps the worst migration of people that the world had definitely seen to that point took place. But India was torn in two, and the state most affected was my state, Punjab, where my people have always been. And you say, my state, my home? If you look at people, Sikhs on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you'll often see pictures of the Punjab, of the fields, of the Golden Temple. And if you look at the hashtags, you'll see the word home. You will see the word home in many of these. Sikhs, despite our diasporic growth, despite being represented in pretty much every country in the world, for us, home might be the dress you live at, but the deeper home, the spiritual home, the connected home that we have is Punjab. It will always be Punjab. Punjabi, the language we speak, is our mother language. So for us, when the Punjab got ripped in half, yeah, and in hundreds of thousands of people who feared being left in that country because of communal issues, which are whipped up by various people, we had hundreds of thousands of people from this side trying to cross into the east, and the opposite from the other side. So what happens when you have two people who fear their neighbours, who fear the land they now live in? They collide. And what you saw was death on an unprecedented scale. Neighbours killing neighbours. And one of the key and perhaps most shameful and critical activities within all of this, within all the killing, within all the burning and the looting, and I mean on an extreme scale, were trains that were crossing the border would cross in both directions, where every single person in the train had been massacred. And when they would arrive at the train station, the entire train would be full of dead bodies. And this happened on both sides of the border. But perhaps one of the most disturbing scenes that I recall reading and hearing about was to do with the honour of women. And many of us will nod and realise, actually, this issue isn't one that's gone away. 60, 70 years on, women, honour, murders, killing, it's still there. And what happened was that when people are crossing this borderline, the men realised that if we meet people of the opposite direction, people that we've got a long fight, people that we struggle and fought shoulder to shoulder with for freedom, who are now our enemies, we may die. But the honour of our women may be lost. They may rape, they may kill, they may mutilate young women. So what happened was many of these women, either voluntarily or were forced to jump into wells and commit suicide, rather than be caught in the violence. This is a shameful part within all of the violence that took place there. But for the Sikh community, for whom Punjab was our homeland, for whom Punjab was our ex-kingdom that we lost to the British, they had more so than anything else. And around 30 to 40% of the Sikh population migrated from what is now Pakistan into what is now India and Punjab. The land of 5 rivers became the land of the 3. People lost their homes, people lost their families, where they'd lived for generations and found themselves in a strange land. And we as Sikhs experienced the brunt of that. So we're independent, we're free. Now, my families were involved in this. My family from my mum's side moved over from Pakistan into what is now India. They had to create a new life. What happened post-independence? So we're free now, should we life's going to be better? Not for the Sikhs and not for the Punjab. India itself was split into linguistic states. So it was reorganised on the basis of language. But for Punjab and Punjabi, it wasn't to be as easy as that. Punjabi was not recognised as the official language of Punjab, which is strange because that's the language they spoke, that's the language they communicated in, that's the language they used to sign documents off. It was everywhere. But yet, the central state, the central government, within a federal system, refused to accept Punjabi as a language of Punjab. Why? Because he argued that the Punjabi people, if they have Punjabi as their language, they feel the sense of homeland, and we are not happy that a people feel that their homeland is a state. Homeland should be the country. If we have a homeland associated with a home language and mother tongue, and a home state, one day these people may wish to go separate, may wish to secede and create their own homeland. An irrational fear, given that the Sikhs have given over 80 to 90% of every single sacrifice for India's freedom. Have a look at the facts if you're interested. And 60,000 people had to court arrest just for the language of Punjab to be accepted as Punjabi. The language, some people say, what's the issue with language? I'm talking to an educated group of people here, so you know the importance of language to a people's identity, to their faith, to their background. It's their mother tongue. We call it a mother tongue because we treat it as if it's our mother. You love it as you would your mother. It's not just a tongue, it's a mother tongue. Our scriptures, our history is all communicated in Punjabi, in a script version of Punjabi. You get rid of the language, you cannot read your scripture, you cannot read your history, you cannot read the things that make me who I am today. The principles that make me who I am today, the values who I am in today, are written in Punjabi. 60,000 people caught in arrest for the establishment of a language that we all spoke. The interesting thing was, again, communal issues within the Punjab created a tension, created a fear that this is a secessionist issue. And there were 6 million Sikhs in 1951 in Punjab, and around 8 million people voted to have Punjabi as the official language of Punjab. 6 million Sikhs. Of the 13 million, and again this isn't about faith or religion, these are just historical facts, there were 13 million Hindus at the time, and yet estimated only 2 million voted for Punjabi as a language. Why? Because there were people stirring up that communal hatred. The worst thing was those people, some of the people who wrote down Hindi as their language actually wrote it in Punjabi dialect, because that was the language they knew. But because Punjabi was now the language of the other, they became an us and them. But we persevered and we got through that. We then came to a phase within our history, my history, where, again, if you're familiar with the Sikh faith, you'll recognise that the Sikh scriptures, called the Guru Granth Sahib, the writings of the Gurus, are now our Guru. We treat them and we believe them to be our current Guru, our current leader. Take instruction from them, take learning from them. And from these scriptures, from these writings, as I said, we draw our strength. We draw our character. We draw our profound belief that the humankind and human race is one. And that as human people, God created us all to be born equal. We have the equal opportunity of obtaining God as a faith, as a people. What differentiates us from one another is our actions, not the colour of our skin, not our height, not our gender. It's our actions that determines one person from another. And this is the philosophy that I gained from my scripture, from my history, from my past. What we started seeing was an attempt to break that link. What was seen as a break that link, because again, there was now the us and the them. And any Punjabi issue was now a Sikh issue, because there is now an us and them. And what we saw was the rise of the human good. So we don't have a human good at the time, but these guys were propped up, they were promoted, and they caused issues within the community. They created a further sense of aggrievement, tension, because what started happening was people started getting killed in protests against these guys. And the next picture is of 1978. These are 13 dead Sikhs who went to peacefully protest against the man I just showed you. And the government was warned that there could be violence, and the government was told that there's tension within the air, tension within the communities. Please cancel the protest, cancel the march, take it elsewhere. But this was held in the holiest of the Sikh cities, Amritsar. It was held in one of the holiest of the Sikh calendar days, Vaisakhi. Now, at a central state level, you have all the information you need to make the judgment and the decision on whether to allow certain events to go ahead or not. The decision was made to continue with this. And when the peaceful protesters went there to protest against some of the things being said, they were fired upon. 13 Sikhs were killed, 80 odd were wounded. The sad fact of this is not the fact that people are killed, which is in itself a great tragedy because there are 13 humans, 13 families, but it's the fact that not a single person was successfully charged with any crime. Every person that was indicated in the violence is acquitted by the courts. The Sikh sense changed further, because we went through a phase where we were living in our own country. We had this sense of freedom, the draw of freedom, from being in the position where we were hunted to freedom, to having lost our kingdom, to having then fought for freedom, not for ourselves but for the entire race and for the entire nation. Sikhs form 2% of India's population, yet we gave 80-90% for our every sacrifice. We got that independence. Promises were broken. We had to fight for our language. We had to fight for our faith, and for the opportunity that our faith wouldn't be misaligned, there wouldn't be interference in our practices. And now, when our brothers were being shot on the streets and we went to justice, we weren't given them. So the human story is one of betrayal, one of feeling like a second-class citizen in a country that you gave freedom to. Now, what's all this to do with me? I said it's my story. It's got something to do with me because my family was involved in these struggles. My uncles, their fathers were involved in these struggles. They were involved in these peaceful protests. They were beaten in these peaceful protests. It matters because as a diaspora we have this connection with the Punjab, we have a connection as a faith with the community, and we have this pain of the us. We call each other brother and sister. There is still that community sense of togetherness, and that we as a community suffer, and we as a community persevere, and we as a community resist. What started happening in the Punjab was the Punjabis and the Sikhs gathered a documentation called the Anandpur Sahib Resolution, which was economic, social and religious reforms that we wanted to see in Punjab, which would have benefited every single Punjabi person in that state, the Sikhs, the Hindus, Muslims, the Christians and the non-aligned. But again, because this was now the us and the them, this was seen as secessionism. And every attempt was made to either water down the demands or to allay the demands, not deliver promises. And in the peaceful protests, again, I followed through with this. Peaceful road protests, roadblocks, water canal blocks. There were even a jail, well, it's called jail borough, which means fill the jails. So when there was curfew introduced, people would voluntarily break the curfew, be arrested, and after 2 or 3 weeks, when they were due for release, would refuse to leave the prisons, refuse to leave the jails, until the jails got so full they couldn't arrest anybody else. Again, these were the peaceful protests that people were undertaking. And for all of this, the government and the police and the army took a very harsh stance. But rather than listen to the demands of the people, or the cause of the people, for economic, social and religious justice within that state, they responded with violence, torture and abuse. And again, I'm telling you this today because it happened to my own. My uncles were beaten. 3 uncles. They were hung upside down in police cells and they were beaten until my family was happy, until my family was able to pay a ransom for their release. The kind of things that happened to young Sikh men, they'd be beaten, and some of the tortures that the Punjab police became famous were, one of them was called well, basically they would take the thighs, split the thighs open and put chili powder into the legs. Another famous one they were quite famous for was pulling off the fingernails and toenails. Another one they called a cordon. Again, this cordon is basically a wooden pole about 6 inches in diameter, a couple of feet long, and they would basically place a person on the floor, stand an individual on both sides, and basically crush the thigh muscles as they roll it over your legs. These kind of things. And these kind of things I'm sure you'll have come across in different countries, different types of torture, across the world. And this is a human story. This isn't just the Sikhs. We're not here today to just cry about what happened to the Sikhs. We're here today to give you another example of the kind of genocide, the kind of persecution that happens across the world to every type of person. And to say that this is a human experience, this is a human story. So these kind of things were happening. But not only was it a physical violence and a physical attack on the self, it was a mental attack. Sikhs don't consume tobacco. So what happened? When they were taking young Sikh men and women into prison, they would spit tobacco in their mouths. Baptized Sikhs or Sikhs who have been initiated don't cut their hair. So what the police would often do is forcibly shave or cut the Sikhs' hair. Again, as an attack on their faith. And as I mentioned yesterday, there's a picture. I studied the Holocaust in the media, journalistic Holocaust. And one of the images which I wrote about while I was at university at your age was an image of a Jew. And this Jewish man was standing there with beard, and 2 Nazi soldiers were standing before him. And one of them had a hold of his beard and had a hold of a pair of scissors. Was about to cut his hair, cut his beard. And the second soldier was standing there laughing. And I've shared this picture with you today because we're looking at the similarity in the picture which I studied from the Holocaust and the picture here which took place in the 80s. You might think, well, we shave every day, we cut our beards every day, what's the pain in that, what's the significance of that? But this Jewish male, it represented who he was. It was beyond the physical. It even went beyond the spiritual. It was who he was as an individual. If you describe what he was, he might give you a name, he might give you a geography, he might give you a vocation, but this was actually who he was. And the trimming of the beard, to him, would have been more painful than if he'd cut off his hand. And I saw the eyes of the second soldier, and I apologize for having the image today, and the eyes of the second soldier were exactly the same as the eyes of the officers you see over there, biting his lip in enjoyment, looking on. He deserves it, give him another one. And here, whilst it's not a beard that's been trimmed, here it's been a turban that's been slapped off the head of the young Sikh. For a Sikh, a turban is a symbol of our royalty. Young Sikhs, males and females, were erected as a symbol of our royalty. In the UK, the British police are not allowed to touch a Sikh's turban without asking beforehand. So for us, to have a turban knocked off our heads, put on the floor, kicked around, is a great insult. The worst thing we can do. So these are the kind of attacks that were going on against the Sikhs, physical and emotional. And I've put down there a life of dignity. Who doesn't want to live a life of dignity? A few words: self-respect. A few words: identity. The ability to live and identify yourself as you choose to see fit. But when you have an us and a them, your identity identifies you as the other, as the them, and that identity then becomes a problem. In Punjab, a popular cry became Gach Karban Kara, Gach Ganga Karban, Inu Bejo Pakistan. What that means is take the Kashera, which is a symbol of the Sikhs, take the Ganga, which is a symbol of the Sikhs, take the Karban, so from here, as a symbol of the Sikhs, and send these all to Pakistan. They're not welcome in India anymore. So the us and the them became resident in the clothes that we wore, the language that we spoke, the way we prayed, the way we dressed, in every single way. I've come here today wearing an orange turban. This morning I was going to wear a blue one, but then I changed my mind again and wore an orange one. I wore one yesterday. It's not just because I like the colour orange, I genuinely do. But for us as Sikhs, the colour orange represents sacrifice. And during this period, the colour orange meant you were the other. It meant you were a secessionist, meant you were an extremist, meant you was a terrorist, meant you were open to abuse and violence. Just the colour orange. This became a symbol of the other, which was at this point the Sikhs. Family. Again, violence against women was common, orchestrated by the police and the government. Where Sikh males were being beaten up, tortured, killed. It was still a macho thing. In many cultures and communities across the world, to die for your faith or to die for your community still seems a macho thing. And many people, men, are willing to make that sacrifice. But you bring women into the equation, and you say to the man, if you don't back off, you don't change the way your approach is, you don't change your demands, we will attack your women. Women again are seen as property in this sense. We will rape, we will embarrass. The decision becomes a bit more difficult and machoism is gone. And women were routinely raped. A book by a lady called Sufi Mahmood, who's an anthropologist, an American anthropologist, I believe. She wrote a book called Conversation with Sikh Militants following the Syrian civil war. And in her book, she interviews one Sikh militant who testifies when she says, what was the worst experience of you in prison? What was the worst experience that you endured? And he said, it wasn't when they beat me. It was the worst thing for me, the worst memory of prison cells, is hearing the screams of my sisters in the cell next door. But a life of freedom is one we all adhere to, all desire. The freedoms of humanity, which you are all familiar with. These who are being denied to the common man. And maybe perhaps more than anything else, a life without fear. Know that if I walk out that door today, I will come back home. For many that didn't happen. And all of this was before the year of 1984. I'm talking to you this day because this happened to my own family. But in all of this, a man came to the forefront and he became a leader for the Sikhs. You'll recognise his face there, you'll see my t-shirt here as well today. This man became a hero for the Sikh community because what he did was he brought the community together. He brought them together and he gave a voice. And he was a fearless man. He was a fearless man. And what he said to the Sikhs was, you don't have to live a life of slavery. You don't have to live a life of slavery. Your teachings, your scriptures, your history, your philosophy, your theology does not teach you to live a life this way. You are meant to be, and the phrase is Akal Purkh Ki Fauj. Akal Purkh Ki Fauj means the army of God. The army of God is not just there to create and protect the Sikhs. The army of God is there to stand up for righteousness and for justice wherever the need may be. And he said to the Sikhs, if you are meant to be the army of God, is the army of God the one that gets raped? Is it one that endures this kind of violence? Is it the one that endures slavery? Recognize who you are. Empower yourselves as a community. But more so than that, what he did was, he was a man who connected with the common people. As a religious, as a saint, he went from one village to another. And he promoted the basic values of the Sikh faith. And he taught people, keep away from drugs. Very simple stuff. Stop drugs. Stop drinking. Look at the way your life could be improved if you do these simple things. So what's that happening in Punjab? Those people who were alcoholics, those people who are addicted to drugs, stop taking drugs under his influence, under his teachings. And rather than that, they started working at their farms, started looking after their families. So his biggest support base, when he first went out into the Punjab, were women. And again, those of you who are familiar with the issues within the Punjabi community and domestic violence will know how often it's triggered by alcohol. So these women who had been grown accustomed to domestic violence where their husbands would get drunk and then beat them, suddenly realised, wow, Sergeant Nursing is coming into our village, he's reforming our husbands, our sons, our fathers. And now they're waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning doing the prayers and going to the farm. And they're coming home and they're playing with the kids. We all are human beings, we all have a human story. For these women, they're not interested necessarily in the long history I've given you. They're interested in going through a day of their life where they're not humiliated and beaten in front of their kids. This is their human story. And what Sergeant Nursing did was empower them to live a life that they lived. They wanted to live a life of dignity. So drugs was a big issue that he manoeuvred past. He asked people to get baptized, to adopt the Sikh faith formally, and to live that good, healthy, wholesome life that our values propagate. At the same time, he stood firm. At the same time, he stood firm against the state. He said that your persecution can't continue. It won't continue. We won't allow it to continue. And the situation in Punjab deteriorated. I will say about Sergeant Nursing, you see on my t-shirt today, in June of this year, being the 30th year since the Golden Temple itself was attacked, you'll get 2 types of Sikhs: those who love him and those who despise him. Those who love him because he empowered us as a people, gave us the strength and the conviction that we can stand tall and proud and actually resist, love him. Those who say that he empowered the people and that empowerment led to more violence, will hate him. It's a human story, it's based on our own experiences. For me, he's a hero. What you saw was generations coming together. Generations. Because these are the people that had with their own eyes experienced the violence and the terror of 1947. You saw generations that struggled for our language to be established as a language come together. You experienced those people who had fought, written, and socialised the economic, social and religious demands of our people. Intellects, farmers, men, women, children coming together as a community. And what does that give? That great strength. Maybe you're no longer able to go into villages and strip young girls naked in front of the whole village and have nobody do anything. It means you're not able to take the scriptures out of the place of worship and throw them in the streets. Because suddenly a community becomes united. It's no longer just about me, it now becomes about us. If it is about us and them, then become united. What we then saw was an attack launched by the Indian Army on the Golden Temple. The attack took place in its full force on the evening of the 3rd, morning of the 4th of June, 1984, 30th anniversary this year. In this attack, 70,000 troops were deployed across Punjab. 15,000 troops were sent into the Golden Temple complex, which is a civilian complex. The day of the attack was the day of the martyrdom of the 5th Guru. If you recall, I mentioned him right at the start. The 5th Guru is also the founder of this city, of this place of worship, which meant around 10,000 pilgrims were there. Curfew was placed across the state, which meant none of these 10,000 people who had come to worship could go home. Trains were stopped, buses were stopped. So if you can't leave, go back to where you were. 10,000 people were cooped up in this one place. And then the army attacked. And the reasons for the attack are many. They will say, the army, being the they in this case, will say we had no choice. We had to go in and clear out the militants. And we say, could you give us a list of the militants that you were looking to arrest? Could you give us a list of their crimes? Could you give us a list of the murders they've committed? Can you give us any shred of evidence whatsoever? For 30 years we've been waiting for these details. 30 years we haven't had any response. There were at around 200 Sikhs, armed Sikhs, that you'll see today I'm wearing a kapan. The reason I'm wearing a kapan is the Sikhs have a concept called Saint Soldier. The first 5 gurus embodied the concept of saint. The saint is one who controls himself. The saint is the one who has cleansed his inner mind and is free of things similar to cardinal sins. He's one who's free of lust, or is in control of lust, anger, greed, attachment, and ego. That is a saint. One who can control his own mind and his own being. A soldier is one who's able to fight. What you don't have, a saint in itself is not enough. A saint who's occupied in becoming one with God may not feel the pain of another. A soldier who's ready to fight may become overcome by his anger, may be overcome by his greed and his lust. And we see atrocities that we see now in every country in the world. So what the perfect combination was? A saint soldier, a saintly soldier, a saint who is committed to becoming one with God, who has the characteristics of a saint as we understand it, but also when the time comes, out of compassion, is ready to stand and fight for those who can't defend themselves. This is a concept that we believe, this is a concept that we try to embody. So for Sikhs to be armed is a very normal thing. The attack happened, so there's many details on this, but let's focus on the human story. The attack happened, it lasted over 3 or 4 days. Of the 10,000 civilians there, an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 were killed. Tanks were used, heavy artillery was used against a civilian location. That there is an armoured vehicle that was used on the walkway around the Golden Temple. An interesting fact for me, again this is my story, I am what you would refer as a British Sikh, and the Sikhs in Britain have had a long history. Yes, we lost our kingdom to them, but then 88,000 Sikhs were killed in World War I as volunteers. Out of our total population, one of the largest volunteer forces in history. We won multiple Victoria Crosses for bravery, again across both world wars. As a British Sikh community, we're seen as an ideal migrant community. We're upheld as a migrant community. David Cameron's gone on record to say the Sikhs as a community are some people that we admire. Our prison rates are next to nothing. GDP per head is one of the highest education rates in the UK. And every single measure, the Sikh community is an ideal migrant community in the UK. So you can only imagine our shock and horror when earlier on this year, when someone accidentally uncovered a document which proved that the British government had sent an SAS operative into India to advise the Indian government how to attack the Golden Temple. You can only imagine the sense that British Sikhs had at that point of belonging. Do we belong? What's my identity? Because for many young Sikhs across the world, we will quite happily say, we are Canadian, we are British, we are American, we are Japanese, we are Chinese, wherever the Sikh exists. When it comes to the homeland, the majority of Sikhs who are impacted by this will say we are Punjabi. And they will associate with the Punjab. They will, by and large, not associate with India because the atrocities and genocide that India carried out on the Sikh people. They will say Punjab. So as a British Sikh, when I learned, in fact, that my home country, where I was born and raised, was involved in this, suddenly my position of never declaring myself an Indian, I had to question, well, am I British? The SAS operative went in, he advised the Indian Army on how to attack and how to go in and kill the individuals that they were apparently looking for. Use helicopters, zip wires, go in and do this and this. The British government then told us in this year that we owe you no apology for advising how to attack your holiest shrine and how to attack Sikhs and kill Sikhs on this place, because the Indian Army didn't actually carry out our advice, so therefore nothing to do with us, our hands are clean of this. So it's okay to advise on murder, but just because a person doesn't carry out your instructions on the best way to commit that murder, it's okay apparently. Further documentation showed that when genocide was kicking off in the streets of Delhi, which we'll come to shortly, Margaret Thatcher's government and the government of Indira Gandhi, both before and after her assassination, were concerned about the Sikhs raising the voice of struggle in the UK. And documentation shows the British government has said in internal documentation, internal letters, that we must keep quiet the Sikhs in the UK because it jeopardises our trade with India. So the suppression of the free voice, the right of human beings to stand up and protest against genocide in the capital city of India was to be silenced because it jeopardised trade between India and the UK. So back to the attack. This is a holy shrine, the Sikhs. This is akin to the Vatican, the Mecca, for the Muslims and the Christians. People were systematically murdered. The government white paper, the document which evidences and says, explains what happened, why it happened. In its list of deaths, which are grossly misstated, underestimated there, it lists soldiers. It then lists terrorists slash civilians. You might ask, why would it do that? Surely they'd know who they're going for. What they said is we couldn't tell the difference. I don't put words in the mouth, but pretty akin to, they all look the same. They all look the same. Young men, witnesses say, like myself, this is my story. We're taken out of homes, little rooms where they were hiding, taken out of the walkway, kicked to their feet, their turbans, their crowns ripped off their heads, hands tied behind their backs, and then executed at point blank range. Hospital staff who then tried to care for some of the victims when the bodies came in, for autopsy in fact. One hospital worker said, the body came in and I remarked, this one's still alive. A soldier came in, told the worker to step outside, a gunshot was heard. No, he's not. There you see a young child, aged 3, possibly a bullet shot in the right side of his chest and his arm tore off, but it looks like a grenade fragment. And the top picture there, you have body being dragged around and that's blood. And again, this is a holy shrine for the Sikhs. We have then soldiers taking pictures for the family. So you can imagine, 30 years on from this, the damage these pictures do to us today. The most important place for me in the world, and having devastated it with heavy artillery and tanks, people are pausing and smiling for pictures that can do it. There are young people, young men, being arrested, handled and taken away. One individual whose life is documented by an organisation called INSAF, that's ENSAAF, it's an American-based human rights agency looking at these Sikh issues. One of the cases this lady, the author of this one particular book documents, is how a man, I believe his name was Bhai Inderjit Singh, was at the complex. He tried to leave, the police said you can't leave, forced him back inside. He then hid in a room. When he was then brought out of the room, he was shot in the head. He was then arrested and asked why he hadn't left. He said, I couldn't leave, you didn't leave, let me leave. He said, no, you didn't leave because you're a terrorist. They then put him in prison, beat him, and he was then eventually released 4 years later. This was a human experience of many. In the aftermath, in cleansing people up, 18 children were arrested. The youngest of whom was 2 years old, and they were kept in captivity for a year. All the legal process went through, and eventually sought to release. 2-year-old was kept in a prison cell. How do you dispose of the bodies? How do you get rid of 5,000 or 7,000 bodies? By the way, there were no journalists in Punjab at this time. They'd all been cleared out. All domestic and foreign journalists were removed from the Punjab while this attack took place, under a complete cover of darkness. When the bodies are eventually removed, garbage trucks are called in, stinking garbage trucks still with rubbish in the back. The bodies are piled into these. They were then disposed in mass cremation grounds. No wood. There wasn't enough wood to cremate them one at a time. And if you listen, and if you read, and if you hear testimony of people who suffered during this time, again, maybe this is something that you see in other cultures. I look to you for this. But the right to burial, the right to end death and end life in the way you see fit, is very important to the Sikhs. You know what? If you kill my son, at least give me back his body, so I can complete his final rites. No. Pile him in a big pile, stuck mud and set him on fire. This once in cholera, which many of you may have heard, there's a big effort in the city of Toronto to raise awareness of Swanson. Swanson was a human rights activist in the Punjab, and he went around the Punjab after all this happened, and he found mass cremation grounds. The thousands of bodies had been burnt, disappeared, no names, no identifications. And he actually visited Toronto and he spoke. I think he may have spoke in the Canadian Parliament again. Obviously, I don't know the structure here, but I think he spoke in Parliament here, trying to make the Canadian government aware of the atrocities happening in Punjab. You will be unsurprised to learn, on returning to the Punjab, the Swanson cholera was then himself disappeared, never seen of again. This is the man who came to your lands, told you what happened, and he disappeared. Guru Granth Sahib, my Guru, they didn't just attack the Golden Temple to kill people. This was not about killing people This is about destroying the psyche, this is about destroying our heart, destroying our soul, ripping it out. That if you're going to stand against us, you're going to try and resist, we will come into your home, we will come into the most special place you have and demonstrate our might. Demonstrate that you have no resistance against us. I find it hard to look at this picture because what they did was they came into Guru Granth Sahib and they fired bullets into Guru Granth Sahib. For me, this is my Guru, this is what I bow down to, this is who gives me my God, and this is my salvation. And yet, Guru Granth Sahib, the scripture teaches that we are one race. Teaches that God can only be found through love. The Guru Granth Sahib is teaching of includes the writings of Muslim saints, includes the writings of Hindu saints, in the writings of Guru Granth Sahib. And yet, bullets were shot into Guru Granth Sahib. Guru Granth Sahib was urinated on, was set on fire. Was this the terrorist they went after? Dios and them. On start, you can have a look at this. This is the Indian Army Bulletin, the official Army newsletter sent out in June of '84. Those of us who were initiated in the faith were deemed dangerous people created to commit murder, arson, and acts of terrorism. We should be immediately brought to the notice of the authorities. My mum's a baptized Sikh. Everyone describes her. My mum may appear harmless from the outside, but is basically committed to terrorism in the interest of all. My mum's identity and whereabouts must be disclosed. Official Indian Army newsletter, June 1984, the us and the them. Talk about a human story, this is my story, this is me. Delhi, Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her guards. What followed then was similar to the crystal mass experience for the Jews, where lists of homes, residences, businesses owned by Sikhs were distributed to government organised mobs. And genocide was brought to the streets of Delhi. Sikh homes were marked with spray cans, white spray cans. The mobs were then armed with very similar weaponry, were given fuel and vehicles to travel around the country, were set loose. Up to 20 to 25,000 people were killed across the country over a matter of 3 days in the capital of India. You see here trains again of Sikhs having suffered this in 1947. We witnessed it again in 1984. Trains were stopped, every Sikh man was butchered. Soldiers, Indian Sikh soldiers wearing the Indian uniform of the Indian soldier, who were returning to Delhi from the front line against Pakistan, were pulled off trains and murdered. People who were ready to give their lives for their country's freedom were murdered because why? They had a beard and a turban and were the other. That woman there is holding the remains of her husband. This man here, in an attempt to destroy not just the life, but the symbols of the Sikh faith. What they did was they first hacked off his beard, he then managed to escape with his life. He showed up his ID card, this was me. The human story. Sexual abuse against women, rife. Women saw their husbands murdered, burned, their kids hacked to pieces in front of their eyes, and were then taken to homes where they were raped for 3 or 4 days. Often they were raped in front of their husbands before their husbands were killed. These women, 30 years on, still asking for justice. Talk about the human story. What pain would these women have endured and seen? They will not talk to you about what they experienced. Because again, sexual abuse in our community is a taboo issue. Operation Woodrose was seen as a clean-up operation to wipe out Sikh extremism, Sikh separatism across the state. So this man here, now I'll talk to you about a blue envelope landing on my doorstep. My uncle was killed in the field. This man here, who was an apparent extremist terrorist, was apparently fighting a civil war in the middle of an open field with his trousers around his ankles, as all civil wars and freedom fighters fight, obviously. What was happening across Punjab was laws were changed. TADA, Tada Act of '92, made it legal to accept confession under torture. It removed the reference to guaranteeing the freedom of life. The right to life is removed from the legal parts of legislation. People were being disappeared. Acts of criminal acts were being registered against an individual like me. I'd be picked up by the police, they're in a cell, they haven't seen me for 6 months. I then have a list of criminal acts against my name. When my wanted dead or alive price is of a high enough nature, you take me to a field, you make me disappear, I'm killed in an encounter, you collect your money. So don't talk to you about my story. My uncle was killed in this way. He left 2 daughters and a pregnant wife, but then had a 3rd daughter. She hid about 3 years after his death. Genocide. Torture. This is the man, 23 years old, who spoke out against state repression. This is the man, 23 years old, who was boiled alive for raising his voice against state repression. He was part of a student organisation, and I hasten to it. We have the destruction of young life. We have the destruction of life, not only of life, but the picture at the top there demonstrates a man that was dressed in women's clothing and then killed. Because it wasn't enough just to kill people. What you need to do is destroy their backbone, destroy the spirit. And again, you take a man, you take away his machoism, you take away his manliness. Lists of the disappeared. Nothing left but a black and white photo and a name. The families often having to destroy all records, pictures of them after their deaths, execution themselves. So where are we 30 years on? 30 years on, I'd say our community, my community, is left in a position of dead hearts and dead eyes. It's 30 years on, there's been no justice. 30 years on, there is little hope. Those women whose picture I showed you, for 30 years, they've been calling out the names of their oppressors, the people that killed their families. They've identified them. These people are now sitting in the seats of politics. They walk corridors of India's politicians, state judiciary, political office. Modi, who's just been selected in the Prime Minister himself, is suspected of having a hand in the Gujarat massacres, which saw 2,000 Muslims butchered in a similar way to the way Sikhs were butchered in Delhi in 1984. Where is their justice? Why do I do this, you may ask? Because this is my resistance. This is my resistance. This is me paying back my debt to my uncle. Nothing else. I'll tell the story. I'll tell the story of my people. I want to finish off with one final set of words there. But may have got a 2-minute activity, I just asked the group to do. This, for me, is a revolution. For me. Because I have a choice not to care. I work in the city of London, I can make money. I live on, I've got 2 little daughters, I can have a life. For me, it's a revolution against my inner instinct for self-survival. For me, it's putting my neck on the line. For me, it's a story of love. Because it isn't about anger, it isn't about hatred for the other, it's about love for my own. It's about compassion. Because the story I've been playing to you is not one that's unique for the Sikhs. This is a story held and played out across the world, across communities, across people, across genders, age and time. When we look at history, we look at numbers, look at facts, we look at dates, we look at names, and we forget the people. We forget the human. And for me, this is a story, this is a job, this is a revolution of love. When we look at the news and we flick next, oh, another massacre, next, 2 girls been kidnapped, that's really bad, next. We become so desensitized to atrocity, genocide, abuse, violence. I'd say we risk losing our own humanity. So for me, this is all about love. I share this with you to give you an example of my story. I want to ask you to do one little thing for me. Literally, I'm going to give you a minute to do this. 30 years on, a big question within the Sikh community is it time to move on? The big question is it time to move on? It's pretty much, the hope for justice is pretty much disappeared. Conviction are not going to happen. It's dead, is the argument. Move on, forget it, stop doing sessions like this, because all you're doing is pouring salt in wounds. Stop uncovering the past. There is now peace in Punjab. Peace in Punjab means 75% of the youth population are addicted to drugs. Peace in Punjab means every day, every month, 50 farmers are committing suicide because of the economic backlash off the back of this. Peace in Punjab means the massive influx of migration you see in Toronto, because people are desperate to leave that state. There is no future for the state, there is no investment, there is no industrial growth. But this is apparently peace, and therefore we should let it go. Stop. So one is, one of my friends at the back is going to give you a piece of paper. I want to ask you just for 1 minute, if I may, to write down whether you think that we should stop. Is it time to move on after 30 years? Is this now the right time that we as a community say, you know what, forget it. Let's draw around the past, what's happened, time to move on. I'm asking you to do this because I genuinely value your thoughts. You're in a privileged position where you have the ability to see this from a global context. You've studied these things. So I'm asking you, from your position, from a position of people with compassion, people who know how justice works, people who know how these things transpire, please, in your words, write me a few sentences on whether you think it's now time to move on after 30 years. If you can please spend 1 minute doing this, I'll be very grateful. Feel free to leave them on your desks. And if you want to take it away, you can. If you have to leave for me to look at and use as feedback, but then for me to kind of say, look, this is what, as I said, an educator and a group that we value his feedback, then please leave it at the desk. If you want to take it away because you wish to do so, feel free to do that. And final question for me. Thank you, first of all, for listening. And I guess what I'd ask you to do is, I love the fact that you guys are doing this. Because what you people are, people that are going to make the change. I'll come to you to tell my story. I beg you, tell the story. Tell the human story to whoever's willing to listen. If they're not willing to listen, sit them down and tell them anyway. The whole issue of human rights, genocide, is not about numbers, it's not about politics, it's about the human experience, the human story. And for me, what I ask you to do is have that love, have that compassion. It doesn't matter whether it's gender-based, whether it's race-based, colour-based, faith-based, persecution, genocide, violence. These things are not disappearing anytime soon. If we do nothing else, let's at least stand tall, proud, willing, because we have the opportunity to raise our voice, we have the opportunity to tell the story, whereas those who have lost their lives, those who are still suffering repression and suppression today, those who cannot raise their voice look to us with expectation that someone somewhere will care enough to speak my name. In my final words, my uncle's name was Bhai Singh. He lived in a village called Bahina. 3 daughters. Thank you for listening.
Probably the most inappropriate. But what I do want to do is raise 2 things for you. Terms that was used consistently was human stories. We all have human stories. The Canadian Indigenous author and activist Thomas King talks about how we know ourselves and know each other through the stories that we tell. The stories that we've heard today helps us to come together as brothers and sisters in one humanity. The other thing I want to draw to your attention is dead hearts. And strangely enough, I'm not talking about Karl Marx or Max Weber or Emil Durkheim. I'm going to talk with you about a book I've read recently. It's called Stardust. Anybody read the book Stardust? Have I mentioned it before? Yeah. I think it's for 14-year-olds, if I'm not mistaken. But you can buy it relatively cheaply. I think you can get a copy at Chapters for $9. And I'll even write, I can't remember the author's name, but he is actually English. And Stardust. And as I listened to our esteemed guest today talk, I thought about Stardust, and I thought about the metaphor in Stardust towards the end of the book, where a witch was after the heart of an angel. A metaphor for evil and good. And she finally gets the angel. And this old witch is, I don't know, 10,000 years old, but the way that she keeps recapturing her youth is by catching an angel and stealing the heart out of the angel and eating the angel's heart alive. And she perpetuates herself over thousands of years. And finally, towards the end of the book, she catches up with the angel. And she, at this point, is crotchety. She can barely walk because she's literally on her last leg. And so she's desperate for the angel's heart. She's desperate to cut the heart out while it's still alive and consume it. And the angel says to her, I don't fear you. You can't take my heart because I've fallen in love with another. And as I listened, it just struck me is that when we do love, when we're able to open our hearts and we are able to love one another, evil has no power. And as I looked around here today, I thought to myself, how many people in this room have a heritage very similar to the one that was described today? People who may have relatives in Somalia, in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Croatia. People who have relatives in Africa, whose relatives perished in slavery. People from Afghanistan who suffered immense atrocities over the years by imperialist countries for the very, very same reason it was mentioned here. The British wanted the Golden Temple to be destroyed, invaded, not because the people of the Punjab were of a different race, different ethnicity, different culture. That was all rationality. They wanted it because of trade. It was all about money, all about profit. This is really strange for me as a human rights activist to say this, but I want to encourage you to follow the money when you're looking at issues to do with genocide and ethnocide and the killing of people. On the rationale and the justification is that they are of a different race. Because I don't think it's about racism and the other. It's about profitability and greed. Yeah? I'm going to take one more minute of your time. Yeah? And I want you to turn to the person next to you. Or if this happened to be three of you together, that's okay. And I want you just in that 1 minute, just talk to the one person or the two people that you have next to you and just say to you what it is that you feel at this moment. What is it that you feel? So it's a feeling statement that you're going to make. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes. That's all. Just 2 minutes. Go. A feeling statement. What is it? And you know what? I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that you feel because I would be worried about you if you did say something to me about the lack of your humanity. So I'm thankful that you can feel and that you can express your feelings in such a way. Okay? I guess maybe the last thing I'm going to say is that I feel really privileged to have students like you. Privileged that I would be able to share with you and have you share with us your humanity. And I'm just going to end because I think I've talked to you about Paulo Coelho before, who's a Brazilian author. Have I? No? Okay, he's written a book which is called The Alchemist. You can buy that at Chapters 2, really. And I came across it, it was given to me by a friend of mine who is from Colombia. My Spanish teacher says you pronounce it Colombia. Her name is Liliana. And she came to Canada 12 years ago as a refugee. She walked across the bridge at Buffalo, got into a cab, and was driven to Toronto. And 12 years later, she's a citizen of Canada. She had to flee Colombia because she, on Sundays and Saturdays, would go into a camp which was basically homeless people, and she would take food and she'd take clothes to them. And the authorities said, if you continue to do that, we'll kill you. And so she fled Colombia and came to Canada. 12 years later, she was a United citizen. She gave me this book called The Alchemist. And about a month after I had got the book from her, I was giving a talk on human rights in Buffalo at a university. And lo and behold, the very same organization who had spirited her into Canada was the organization that asked me to talk about human rights to their organization. It was kind of freaky. Anyway, I'll just say this, is that Paulo Coelho, in the book The Alchemist, he says many things. But one of the things that he says that I think is very pertinent today is that love transforms the world.